Hello, my name is Janet Lawson, and before beginning my presentation, I would like to thank my co-authors, Isabel Burchill, Dr. Tony Williams, and Dr. Amy Latimer Chung, for their work on this project. This presentation will provide you with an overview of classification in parasport before outlining our study, which explored the role of parasport coaches in athlete classification. Classification is a system of organizing sporting competition, which groups together athletes of similar functional abilities in order to equalize competition. To be classified in sports governed by the International Paralympic Committee, athletes must have one of 8 physical impairments, such as ataxia, limb deficiency, or impaired muscle power. Additionally, athletes must undergo a series of assessments and observations by a certified panel of classifiers, which results in the assignment of a sport class. Current literature, however, indicates this experience is often negative, with athletes reporting negative feelings of surveillance and an overemphasis on their disability. Coaches, however, may play a role in ameliorating these negative experiences. In general, we know that coaches influence many aspects of parasport participation. Recent evidence even suggests that coaches may support athletes during classification. However, little more is known about the specific roles they take on during classification. Therefore, this study purposed to explore the role of coaches in para-athlete classification. Specifically, we sought to describe coaches' roles during classification, and additionally, we sought to examine how coaches learn about classification through the lens of Nelson and colleagues' holistic conceptualization of coach learning. Purposive and snowball sampling was used to recruit 12 coaches to participate in semi-structured interviews for this study. A variety of sports were represented within our sample, which you can see here on the slide. Coaches had worked with athletes with a disability for an average of 19 years, and 2 coaches identified as having a disability themselves and had previously participated in parasport as an athlete. This study was exploratory in nature and used semi-structured interviews to investigate the topic of interest. Throughout the project, decisions were made to reflect the ontological and epistemological paradigms of relativism and constructivism. That is, we accepted the existence of multiple subjective realities which result from interactions between the individual and the world. Our analysis followed Brown and Clark's 6-step guide to thematic analysis, wherein the lead coder familiarized themselves with the data through reading and taking notes of the transcripts. Following this, initial codes were reviewed, revised, and developed into broader themes and subthemes, which reflected overarching patterns. Other members of the research team were engaged as critical friends throughout this process to further develop the analysis. And finally, confirmed themes were written out in full. Throughout the study, Tracy's universal criteria for excellent qualitative research were engaged as markers of rigor. This included addressing a worthy topic, establishing rich rigor through an appropriate sample and ethical data collection procedures, sincerity in the form of reflexivity and transparency of our processes, credibility through the inclusion of rich quotes in our written work, and the resonance, coherence, and contribution of the work. All coaches described their role during athlete classification as an intuitive, logical, and natural extension of their larger role as a coach. The specifics of this role, however, were split into 3 subthemes. The first, preparing the athlete, referred to coaches' responsibility to explain the basics of classification to athletes, support athletes with administrative aspects of classification, such as submitting classification requests and compiling medical documents, and ensuring athletes have a thorough understanding of what to expect from the procedures and possible outcomes of their classification. In some cases, this meant outlining what sporting opportunities would be available to the athlete should they be classified as ineligible to compete. The second, ensuring fairness, pertained to coaches' obligation to advocate on behalf of their athletes for a fair and equitable classification, either through asking the classifiers questions about their decision-making processes, or explaining to classifiers how an athlete accommodates for their impairment so that their functional ability was truly assessed, rather than any tricks the athlete may have learned to use in place of ability. Ensuring fairness also required coaches hold their own athletes to a high standard. By encouraging athletes to neither overrepresent nor underrepresent their level of function, coaches believed they were fulfilling their obligation to uphold the integrity of the system. The third way coaches perceived their role was to frame classification as something outside of an athlete's control, so as to de-emphasize the significance of it to athletes. This served to make classification less stressful for athletes, and also encouraged them to shift their focus away from classification and onto their training. This was particularly salient for coaches of team sports, who spoke of athletes who believed their playing time could be adversely affected by their classification. In consideration of Nelson and colleagues' holistic conceptualization of coach learning, based in Coombs and Ahmed's framework, coach learning can be categorized as formal, non-formal, or informal. This held true in our study. However, formal and non-formal learning opportunities were rare. Just 3 participants reported having completed classifier training, one of the few formal means of learning about classification. However, those who had participated reported this to be an important part of their development as a coach. Most participants spoke of the limited number of non-formal resources available to them, such as brochures or videos which would explain classification. In discussing such resources, coaches indicated that an ideal resource would explain the classification system broadly, as well as the specifics of classification procedures and testing. Moreover, they indicated a preference for resources that were concise and sport-specific and delivered by their national sporting organization. Alternatively, all coaches identified learning on the job as an important means of learning about classification. As one coach said, "We just learned about it from going through the process and doing it over and over and over again with different athletes with different disabilities and different levels of the same disability." Coaches spoke further of their informal learning experiences when discussing collaborating with athletes as an effective way to learn about their needs and how best to support them during classification, as well as to learn about the process of classification itself. For example, another coach said, "I've talked to enough athletes about their classification processes to be able to learn about how things can go awry." Similarly, mentorship, or learning from other coaches, high-performance directors, and others involved in parasport, was integral to most coaches learning about classification. Many similarities exist between the roles of coaches of athletes with a disability and able-bodied athletes. For example, coaches in both contexts may organize practices and work with athletes to develop stress management routines. However, the need to prepare athletes for any outcome of a classification was shown to be a unique aspect of coaching para-athletes. Similarly, this work expands upon our understanding of how coaches may uphold fairness in sport, a relatively under-researched aspect of the coach's role. In terms of learning about classification, the findings of this study align with current literature, which indicates a reliance on experiential learning among parasport coaches. In fact, evidence suggests that experiential learning may be preferred by elite parasport coaches. However, our work indicates that this premise should be accepted cautiously, as our findings also indicate that there is a demand for and a significant lack of formal and particularly non-formal resources pertaining to classification in parasport. Thank you so much for listening.